The invasion by the North Koreans of South Korea was an act of aggression designed to bring the whole of the Korean peninsula under communist.
Welcome to Real Talk. I'm Kathy Choi.
What's going on? Danny Cho here.
61 years ago this month, North Koreans attacked South Korea to start the Korean War.
Yeah, and the thing is, growing up here, I really didn't know much about it except what my parents told me, and they didn't really know much either.
Well, a lot of people choose not to speak about it, and that's why it's often referred to as the Forgotten War. Well, two of our esteemed guests today will share with us their stories, their knowledge, and specifically about a very bloody battle that happened on Outpost Harry. Brock, Glenn, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please take a moment and introduce yourselves to our viewing audience.
I'm Brock Lippett. I was the first lieutenant with K Company, 15th Infantry in Korea in 1953.
My name is Glenn Palmedo-Smith. I'm a filmmaker from Southern California, and I was commissioned to do a film on the Korean War 3 years ago.
Well, it's been 61 years since the break of the Korean War. Brock, can you tell us what motivated you to join the Army at that time?
I was drafted, and I volunteered to go to Korea.
What specifically was interesting about Korea?
Well, I just wanted to do something, frankly, that my father hadn't done, and I had a brother-in-law that had been decorated in the Second World War pretty good, so I thought I'd try to outdo him.
Tell us why the battle at Outpost Harry was so significant.
Well, it was very important because if the Chinese took that hill, they could be in Seoul in about 2 hours. And the Chinese would have taken an awful lot of land, possibly Seoul and maybe even further south. It was very strategic.
Battle of Outpost Harry was a very, very significant battle, especially for the Korean War, because like you said, if the Outpost Harry was taken over, then, I might not even be here. So can you describe the situation a little bit more in detail? Like, I didn't know about, the Greek soldiers as well as other, coalition UN forces.
Well, there are a lot of United Nations troops involved over there, Greeks, Turkish, French. I was attached to the Greeks. Mm-hmm. They ended the Battle of Outpost Harry, the last 2 days of it, as I remember. But they were fabulous fighters.
The battle lasted for
8 days.
8 days.
Yes.
And you were the first company out there.
When we got hit, yes.
Tell me what it felt like stepping out onto that post that first night.
Well, we knew, our Corps General had told us that we were going to get hit, and we just tried to prepare as best we could, registering artillery and digging deep trenches and getting prepared for the battle.
How many men were there with you that night?
There were about 250 to 300 on the outpost.
In terms of the mindset, was fear ever a factor, or was there a point where you were like, you know what, let's do this?
Well, you didn't have much time to think about anything except do your job.
So there were 200 or 300 men with you that night?
Yes.
And how many walked off that hill?
As I remember, 28.
So a lot of men were hurt.
We lost 700 killed and wounded in 8 days, as I remember.
Glenn, you're the first American director to approach this subject, and your documentary is called Hold at All Costs. What does that mean, to hold at all costs?
As I understand it, the order is given, this probably dates back to Roman days. I mean, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, It is told to a soldier, you are to hold this position at all costs. It means you cannot walk away, you cannot leave until ordered. I picked the title of the film, Hold at All Costs, to really signify the entire Korean War, that this line, this 38th parallel was going to be held at all costs. The communists were not going to come into South Korea. So it becomes a euphemism for the entire conflict, this one battle, as I perceived it.
It's sort of like the goal line stance in football, pretty much, except with a more serious consequence.
Very serious consequences. Right? It was almost as if the U.S. Army or intelligence or political system was fighting the Chinese political system, and they're having a giant football game with lights and illuminated skies. And I just want the audience to understand that it was like a giant football game, but the score was with bodies, not with touchdowns.
But what about the other outposts and posts where, you know, some of them did get taken over by the Chinese?
Yeah, so Pork Chop Hill was lost and then it was regained. There were many battles of equal horrific standards. We just picked this one because it's at the end of the war. But you know, a lot of times the Army would then say, this is not worth holding, and they would retreat. And this would be an order to retreat, and a dignified order. But at Outpost Harry, the order was, you stay and you don't go, you don't leave. And this went on for 8 days, and it's horrific.
So 8 days of constant fire at this outpost.
Yes.
How many Americans fought there?
Well, there were 5 rifle companies involved, plus the Greeks, and I don't know how many companies they had out there, probably 2. So there were probably 7 rifle companies involved.
Brock, I know it must have been a horrific experience for you. Was there anything that really stood out when you were out there the first night?
No, it was just a mess.
It was just...
We fired over 100,000 artillery shells that first night in defense, and the Chinese fired estimated 30,000 back at us.
Wow.
I mean, the type of devastation that we're talking about in terms of human lives is so huge. You know, for your company to be having started out with 200, 300 men and to walk off that hill with only 28, but the Chinese suffered even greater losses. Much
greater losses. Our estimates are as much as high as 20,000 over the 8-day battle. Wow. It's probably more like 8,500. I've chose to pick a number around 6,500. The Chinese, of course, they want to be very insistent that it was only 1,200. So who knows? Brock, I think you believe it was 20,000.
I read estimates 20,000. They were stacked like cordwood.
Wow.
One of the things that you were describing earlier was as infantrymen were trying to come and relieve some of the people that were left, you'd literally have to walk over bodies that had fallen. You couldn't get them off the hill fast enough. At what point during that battle were you able to move the bodies?
Well, they started bringing the wounded and dead out immediately. And that was one of the worst jobs I had, was going to graves registration and identifying bodies, saying put that head with that pair of legs, or that chest goes with that head, because I knew most of the men, and that was not fun.
The Greeks, when I interviewed them, they spoke of having arrived with their troops, and the smell was so bad that they would take foot spray or insect repellent and literally spray it up their nose and as relief. So you'd rather smell that than the death. The Chinese, when I interviewed them, they said their secret was to use T-shirts or clothes, dip it in gasoline and tie it around your head, just to rather smell that than to smell this death. I think it was on the 7th day the U.S. Army dumped diesel fuel on the whole mountain and lit it on fire just to burn off the remains, and it still did not get everything.
Wow.
Let's take a look at the documentary Hold at All Costs and hear from the soldiers who served there.
And so MacArthur designs this remarkable amphibious assault at Incheon and literally cuts across the island, captures tens of thousands of North Korean soldiers.
What MacArthur underestimated was that the Chinese were so sensitive to their border, and they were so worried that we were establishing a base from which to attack them.
为什么呢？我们要加入这场战争呢？因为把战火已经烧到我们的国家的这个边界。
The sides battled relentlessly for control of critical terrain from 1951 until 1953, as the peace negotiations dragged on.
They destroyed bunkers during their artillery. They got men in the bunkers. They shot our men in the trenches.
We used to joke about it in Officers Canada School that if everything else goes to hell, you can always call in time on target.
Time on target, or fire VT, a last resort technique used when the enemy has completely infiltrated one's position. The commander orders his troops to take refuge in bunkers, as supporting artillery fire is directed upon their own position.
Some of the guys I've seen come back, and when he come out the war, they still want to fight. They still want to fight the war. And I still fight the war in my dream.
I hit my wife without thinking one night. I was asleep. I didn't mean to hit her. She never said anything to me. And she never asked me either what had happened. It was 53 years before I told anybody.
My name is Palmedo-Smith. I'm the director of Hold at All Costs, a film on the Korean War, and you're watching Real Talk.